First of all, I would like to say thank you to Danny Pilario and his crew for organizing this beautiful congress, allowing us to meet and share our experiences and thoughts here. For me, traveling to the Philippines for the first time evokes memories of my childhood, when my parents told us stories about missionaries going to people far away to preach them the gospel of Christ. As my father was a lay worker for the missionaries of the Divine Word in their mother house in Stijl in the Netherlands, just a few kilometers from the place where we lived at that time, my brother and I would know that the Philippines too were such a foreign country where missionaries of the Divine Word were present. However, I also had the opportunity to meet Philippine fathers and sisters who came to visit our parish. And I found it very exciting to see these people looking so different from us and having made a journey from the other side of the world. You see, I was in a real orientalizing, exoticizing, but also very fascinated mood. And I have to confess that yesterday evening was like a déjà vu for me. The Philippine missionaries were accompanied by a dancing group, and the dancing I did yesterday evening with my lovely companion was something I did in my hometown when I was 10 years old. Imagine that. Much later only, during my theological studies, I became aware that Arnold Jansen founded his congregation of the Divine Word in a time when the German emperor was trying to get foothold in the Pacific for colonies, looking for colonies, and that one of the so-called protected territories, today New Guinea, at the time named Kaiser Wilhelmsland, was a region where Jansen sent his missionaries. Today, the Steiler congregation, like many others involved in missionary activities, is ready to analyze critically the motivations of the past. Their fathers, sisters and brothers had a genuine will to save souls, as they said, which after Vatican II had to be spelled out quite differently. They had a consciousness to bring civilization to people, ethnologically interesting, but culturally and sometimes morally deficient. Or, in the case of the Philippines, a people too weak to nurture their Catholic faith of their own. This, of course, was a way of perception which today is seen as expression of Western arrogance. Their missionaries were taking some distance to parts of the colonial rule in its concrete shape, and at the same time they knew about the need of political support for their missionary activities. In the case of the Philippines, the support of the recently arrived United States. Hence, a situation of living in the contact zone between colonizer and colonized with all its ambiguities. Coming to the Philippines as a German Catholic theologian and biblical scholar makes me aware of that history. Coming here as a Catholic woman theologian, still not a very common combination even in our country, and as mother as two adoptive daughters, abundant children as they were, one from South Korea and the other from India. This allows me to bring in a biography not very typical for mainstream Western theologians, a biography in which might have helped me in developing a certain sensitivity, at least, for what is called the postcolonial discourse. In my case, in interference with feminist and gender issues. So let me share with you some observations and reflections around the well-known programmatic verses from Paul's letter to the communities in Galatia, the little biblical paragraph Bishop Ambo and I agreed upon to comment. I repeat verses 27 and 28 of the 3rd chapter. For you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free person, there is not male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. Now, should I, according to Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak's rhizomatic procedure of thinking and writing, interrupt my speech already here and ask what I'm doing when reading these biblical verses in English as a translation from Greek, and when presenting that biblical paragraph to you in such a way? do I use the imperial language of our times to render the imperial language of Greco-Roman antiquity and to suggest that there is one clear, distinctive, and timeless understanding of what is meant by these biblical verses? Or is the English language rather a medium of communication, welcome throughout the globe, useful for me when talking to all of you present here with your different linguistic and cultural backgrounds, without the need of an interpreter? Is English a tool apt to translate Paul's Koine Greek, through which he addresses the communities in Galatia of different populations? Bishop Ambo spoke about it. Paul himself, coming from a hybrid background as a Hellenistic Jew, as a representative not of any hegemonic political or cultural power, but of a new faith community between many firelines? Or have things to be spelled out in even much more complex and differentiated way? Think, for example, of the Japanese bishops Felix Wilfred told us yesterday, or think of Jose Mario's remarks on translation. Within the framework of my short paper, I can just raise these questions and ask you to keep them in your mind, as those are questions not trivial for biblical theologians, especially when they work in an intercultural setting as we do here. At any rate, what I try to develop now is just an offer from my very limited possibilities. To read the Bible with a postcolonial lens can be done in many ways. I suggest to take as starting point the biblical text as porous text, we had that expression yesterday from Felix, that is as a text with many gaps, and as a fluid text, in the sense that already in the context of the New Testament, the formula in Galatians 2:28 takes on different meanings. I will use this fluidity and porosity to show you some readings I consider fruitful. The image of clothing oneself with Christ in verse 27 remembers a baptismal rite, and it seems that in his letter to the Galatians, Paul uses the allusion to baptism to make a strong plea for a strong point for his plea not to impose circumcision to men who wanted to belong to the community of Christ. In this rhetorical context, the first pair in the tripartite formula, the pair of neither Greek nor Jew, gets most of the weight, while slave or free, male and female, recede into the background. But even the pair of Jew and Greek would not point to general ethnical or cultural differences, but have its focus on the contrast between circumcised and non-circumcised. Correspondingly, oneness in Christ can be understood as argument not to insist on markers on the naked body, but to build on a new skin offered by Christ as garment, hence the investiture into children and heirs of Abraham. For here we get Paul's key concern in his dispute with the Galatians. Non-circumcised become, along with circumcised, part of the Abrahamic family, and the blessings promised to Abraham by entering into communion with Christ. At this point I have to interrupt myself again and stress that according to the so-called new perspective of perceiving Paul's letters, Paul, to put it sharply, is not a Christian but a Jew who became adherent to a new inner Jewish movement proclaiming the risen Christ, and open to include non-Jews as full members. And I'm very grateful to you, Bishop Ambo, that you explained that in extenso. The severe polemics in his letter to the Galatians is not against Judaism as a whole, but against those who recoil from seeing Jews and non-Jews sitting at a common table, 1 Corinthians 11, in a metaphorical but also in a very concrete sense. Maybe the reason that I want to stress this point is that I feel to have to bring it in as a German scholar aware of the history of my country, to which belongs the Holocaust, the attempt to eliminate the Jewish people in the name of a racist and nationalist ideology. I'm also aware that the Catholic Church in these years was too much involved in their own fears and at the same time too much imprisoned in a theology of Christian supersession over against Judaism to clearly realize and to resist against what was going on. I'm glad that the Second Vatican Council set the tone for theology of Judaism which is able to appreciate Judaism as being at the roots of Christianity, and to respect Jews as our elder brothers and sisters who take their own way on the road to God the Father. I do hope that this part of Catholic theology will not be considered here as a part of Western colonialism. Could it be helpful to remember that Judaism is an Asian religion too? Let me come back to Galatians. The feminist scholar Brigitte Kahl, who is teaching now in the US, has called that letter, for evident reasons, the most phallocentric document in the New Testament. Paul's insistence on the problem of circumcision focuses on men, and thereby underlines the concept of religious affiliation for which males are decisive. In some cases, this might have aptly corresponded to baptism of a pater familias with his whole house, as is told in Acts 16 about the jailer in the city of Thyatira. But in Acts and in the Pauline letters, we also encounter women and their house, as Maria and Lydia in Acts and Nympha in Colossians. To such a woman, Greek and Jewish alike, the question of circumcision would not have been relevant for herself, but for males in her household, especially her male slaves. The formula of Galatians 3:28, affirming that there is neither slave nor free, would include slaves who need no circumcision to be in Christ. But here, another problem comes into view. According to Torah, the Mosaic law, Jewish families had to keep Shabbat, rest from work, and they had to include slaves and even animals into that rest. How would slaves be treated in households who considered themselves one in Christ? Paul's insistence that the Jewish law has to be replaced by faith in Christ cannot signify that it is allowed to abrogate prescriptions protecting slaves against exploitation. Neither slave nor free but one in Christ, then, is a formula which asks to rethink the Mosaic law in the light of Christ and to affirm to use its resources for living together as a community. And more than that, as far as we can see, Paul himself did not yet imagine that the institution of slavery in itself was problematic. But the formula, neither slave nor free, is so open in its wording that it has the potential to stimulate imagination and to push it further into political, social, and economic issues. To the women in the Galatian community, the third part of the formula, that there is not male and female, might have been of particular interest. It might have been heard by them as an indication that through baptism, not only males but also females receive their new garment in Christ. For a free Greek woman in Hellenistic Roman times used to choose her religious affiliation herself, for example, by being a member of a tiasos, a religious voluntary association of devotees of a particular deity, baptism might have been an attractive way to be accepted in that new faith community as someone standing on her own, and not simply as being included as wife of a husband. And having her female slave standing beside her, also receiving such a garment, might have provided at least an utopia of equality. Given all this, the communities of those baptized in Christ certainly had the potential to become a kind of third space, where new, hybrid forms of interactions became possible. With these speculations, I already left the context of the letter to the Galatians and started to explore the hypothesis shared by many scholars that verse 28 is not a formula coined by Paul, but a tradition he received and adopted, a tradition linked to a baptismal rite proper. The formula might indeed have had that specific Sitz im Leben, and there it gains a lot of further possible meanings. I want to restrict myself to the third member, not male and female. From a gender-sensitive perspective, the different formulation here, compared to the other two, is significant. It is not neither male nor female, but it is not male and female. Therefore, it is probably a quotation from Genesis 1:27, a verse which states that God created humankind, male and female. What does it mean then? That in Christ there is not male and female. Already in the 1st century after Christ, a range of interpretations was developed. For example, when we remember that God created humankind, male and female, and ordered them to multiply, it becomes plausible that the formula, there is not male and female, could be heard as invitation to renounce on procreation and to live an ascetic life, attractive for women. When putting in the forefront the power relations existing between slaves and their masters, not male and female, could be interpreted as a formula negating hierarchical power relations between men and women. Some early Christian groups, the so-called Montanists, even are known as accepting women as priests and bishops. These groups became marginalized. Probably their practice was considered too radical in their times. Today, the situation could be different. Most of the reasons given by the Catholic Church to exclude women from ordination are not very convincing. The audience of the 850 women superiors from all over the world with Pope Francis in May 2016 showed to me that, on a pastoral level, Pope Francis is open to the logic of their questions or suggestions when they asked to rethink the strong bond of decision-making in the Church, preaching the homily and ordination. But it seems that there are strong powers behind him who prevent that his practical conclusions or intuitions can be transformed into a revision of the doctrine. As Elisabeth Schüssler-Fiorenza, well-known feminist theologian and for a long time member of Concilium, suggests, we should not try to retrieve the one and only correct historical meaning of our verse in Galatians 3:21-28, but we should insist on clarifying our own criteria when opting for a chosen reading. For Elisabeth Schüssler-Fiorenza, who will celebrate her 80th birthday next year, it is put very briefly and spelled out in her own words, the fight for the notion that women are people. I would like to shift the focus a bit and ask if the formula of not male and female could be opened to include persons who find themselves in one form or another between the two sexes. In our country, we have a vivid public discussion about this phenomenon, about persons claiming their rights as intersexuals or as transsexuals. Within the New Testament, there's one figure which might represent this constellation, the Ethiopian eunuch traveling to Jerusalem as narrated in Acts 8. As eunuch, he is a no male, probably castrated. The fact that he came to Jerusalem for worship shows that he has understood the vision of Isaiah as invitation for himself, namely that to those eunuchs who keep my Shabbat, says God, I will give them in my house and within my walls a monument and a name. On his way back home, the eunuch is reading the Isaiah passage on the lamb being slaughtered without opening its mouth, and he is wondering if it relates to the life of the prophet who wrote down his words, a very possible explanation, or to someone else. Philip, one of the 12 followers of Jesus, explains to him that the passage relates to the Christ, and the Ethiopian eunuch gets convinced by his interpretation and asks to be baptized then. He is the example of a God-fearing person, a proselyte to Judaism, being brought to faith in Christ by reading the Jewish scriptures. If he had heard the formula of Galatians 3:28, he would have been able to understand it as a confirmation of the Isaiah vision that eunuchs have access to the God of Israel. The formula in Galatians 3:28 then has the potential to relate to his situation, although it is not clear if such a situation has been in view by those who coined it. The figure of the Ethiopian eunuch opens up this formula even more because he is neither Greek nor Jew, he is Ethiopian, so the question of color comes in. He is neither slave nor free, as he is a very high official at the court of his queen. Philip, the follower of Jesus, who baptized the Ethiopian eunuch, goes a step further than Paul. Philip's interpretation of oneness in Christ gives space to persons who do not obey the binary formula. There is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, not male and female. So, could it be a nice coincidence that the country where I developed on Philip and his inclusionary politics is called the Philippines? And thank you.